this group. I tried everything. I couldn't get them to talk. They clammed up. Finally, I asked them, what's keeping you so quiet? Are you tired? Did you not eat breakfast? I always bug them to eat breakfast. Silence. Is it that you aren't sure why the ad would be offensive? I asked. Few people nodded. Oh no, I thought. Is it that you're not sure whether the Holocaust happened? Yes, several people nodded. It was a terrible moment in my teaching career. The revisionists had gotten to them and the propaganda had worked. They were well-meaning students, but they were empty of factual information, fertile ground for racist disinformation. So I took a poll. 12 of 24 students raised their hands, half the class, to admit that they were not sure whether the Holocaust had happened. So that was the day that freshman composition turned into a micro-history of the Holocaust, with lots of horrific photos that I brought back from France. All the really horrible photos of the concentration camps are in the European books, not in the American books. They just have different sets of photographs. And I brought them all in and made them look at them. And I showed Schindler's List, which is really quite tame as a portrayal of the Holocaust anyway. It's like the good German who was nice, you know, and yes, he was nice. He also had free labor for his factory. I mean, it's like the Hollywood films about, you know, Kevin Costner. He's really nice to the Native Americans. You know, he's always the good white guy. You know, it makes the audience feel better, because they won't pay to see what really went on. So I expected about the same here in Michigan. Only one person in my class of 23 had heard of Burma, and none of them knew of the imprisonment of the democracy leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. But the great thing was I didn't have to lecture. They wouldn't have to be grumpy about suddenly being in a political science course. They learned about the human rights abuses by the Burmese military regime, but we were reading folk tales, and so we talked about why the tales are so sad, and that leads us into the real events. I had them write short bios of themselves and a page or two of responses, and we sent them to Sally. I guess I don't have the, sorry, I don't have the photographs. I took a photograph of the class. So they learned about Burma being ruled by the military regime, and we had a lively discussion when one student said, so what's wrong with the military regime? And it makes perfect sense because they all have friends and relatives in the military. Some of them are in ROTC. It pays their tuition. It makes perfect sense. Military to them is not a problematic term, even when it's paired with the term government. So we talk about that. It's good discussion. So we talk about the generals leading the government, the human rights abuses, the fact that the army does large-scale trafficking in heroin and uses child labor, forced child labor for that. Burma is a major exporter of heroin. Yet the country is festooned with images of Buddhism and symbols, temples, a focus for an increasingly important tourism industry, big magnet. But while tourism has been this magnet for foreign investment, the people have not benefited in the least. So the stories that we read, some of them are typical analogs of the Aesop's tradition. They have the rabbit, the clever rabbit or the clever fox. But some of them are absolutely unique. One called The Hunter and the Lion. A hunter meets a lion, and he fears for his life. He says, "Don't kill me," to the lion. And the lion says to him, "Do you love your life?" "Yes, I do," says the hunter. And the lion advises him, "If you love yourself, do not take another's life. They also love their life, as you do." And the hunter never hunted animals again. Another tale is set in the forest, where many plants and animals live together in balance. That's a quote from the story. The tale describes an ecosystem in non-scientific terms. When hunters invade it to cut it down and kill the animals who live there, the forest's magical powers cure them of that urge. It's the environmentalists' ultimate fantasy. The hunters realize that their minds are greedy. Another quote from the story. And once they learn that, their minds have been healed of the urge to kill. Another story, The Monk and the Monkey. The monkey asks the monk what it means when humans sit under his tree and cry and talk about the trouble in their lives. He wants to know what trouble is for humans. When he learns about the violence, the brutality, fearing for one's life, the monkey never again looks for trouble. The small chicken stars, another story, very sad story, reveals so much about what its tellers have seen. A hen and her rooster and their chicks live at a farmer's house, but one day important guests visit the house. The farmer must serve dinner to the guests, and they need meat for the soup. The farmer comes toward the hen coop, and the mother hen knows she will be killed. She tells her baby some last words in her last moments. When I'm not here with you, please don't feel sad. Don't be cruel to each other. Don't steal things. Please obey me. After this, we won't see each other again, and you won't have your mother. Starting tomorrow, you must find your own food. When you get cold, you'll have to hug each other to be warm. The farmer comes, takes the hens away to kill her. The chicks were sad without their mother. They couldn't find any food. They missed her. When the rainy season came, they were very cold, and they were very weak. They knew they wouldn't survive. So they decided to jump into the fire together and kill themselves. But before they jumped, they said, "Our lives without our mother is like a banana tree without branches." And they all died. After they died, they went to the sky, and they became stars in the night sky. And at night, we can see these stars. In the Shan language, we call them Lao Gai Nai, or the small chicken stars. So these stories do not, for the most part, have the happily ever after endings, but they have a love of nature and of family and tradition. And most of all, a peaceful way of living underlies every one of the stories. These stories are not the Brothers Grimm canon in which stupidity is punished ruthlessly, and the kill or be killed behavioral ethic. But more interesting were the contemporary folk tales, very original, that the Shan students wrote. And they gave us glimpses of their personal lives, domestic politics, emotional struggles. These tales are drawn from their actual lives and the cruelty they have seen. In A Parrot's Reward, a parrot lies in a ditch, bloodied, dying. A widow who has just sent her 3 children far away to be educated, perhaps never to see them again, finds it, tries to stop the bleeding. The grateful parrot finds a way to make the widow rich. He knows of some stolen gold buried under a tree, and he directs her to the gold. So here we have the rags to riches formula, but without the wealthily ever after. She donates the money to the Buddhist monastery. Another tale tells of the cyclone Nargis, an actual event, very devastating. And the monks and nuns are the ones who take care of the people. People get no help from the government. Sounds familiar. I'll skip that one. I'll leave time for Barb. In another tale, a boy dreams that his abusive alcoholic father will stop beating his mother, and it comes true. They live peacefully ever after. The story ends. So these tales are not about getting rich and moving into a palace. They evoke moving on after losing a loved one, struggling against injustice, and seeking a peaceful life. They were a very poignant gift to my class and my students. My students were very quiet and very thoughtful as we discussed these, but they paid attention. So finally, I had my students research the life and work of Suu Kyi, the popularly elected leader of the democracy movement that I just mentioned. We looked at the Burma situation through the folktales and through her life, and they did learn the facts about this. She, in 1988, she did win 82% of the seats, 82%, a landslide of the seats in parliament. But there were massive protests against the military regime, and there was a vicious crackdown. She was sentenced to house arrest, house arrest, and she was arrested again in 2003 after protests in which 100 of her supporters were beaten to death. She is the only imprisoned Nobel laureate. So I will conclude by reading quotes from an interview with Suu Kyi during her first house arrest. The interviewer asked her about how the Burmese government touts tourism as the great future of Burma. Foreign business coming to Burma, especially tour companies, and the hypocrisy of such business partners. A British Foreign Office press release, for example, reads, "Through commercial contacts with democratic nations such as Britain, the Burmese people will gain experience of democratic principles." Such a claim is breathtakingly disingenuous, and Suu Kyi refutes it firmly. "Not in the least," she says. "New investments will only help a small elite to get richer and richer. Forced labor goes on all over the country in the tourist industry, much of it by children." Some memorable words of Suu Kyi that my students found the most powerful. She says, "Democracy is not finished in Burma. Look at the courage of the people on the streets who go on working for it, even though they've been to prison and they know they will be back in prison soon. They don't give up." The interviewer asks, "But how do you reclaim the power you won at the ballot box with brute power threatening you?" She replies, "In Buddhism, we are taught there are 4 basic ingredients for success. The first is the will, to want it, then the right attitude, then perseverance, and wisdom." "But," the interviewer says, "the other side has guns." "Yes," she says, "but it's becoming more difficult to resolve problems by military means. It's no longer acceptable." But the interviewer asks, "But weren't there times when, surrounded by an army, cut off from your family and friends, imprisoned in your home, that you were terrified?" "No," she says, "because I didn't feel hostile towards the guards surrounding me. Fear comes from his hostility, and I felt none towards them." "Do you worry that you might be trapped in a terrible stalemate?" "I am not fond of that expression," she replied sternly. "Ethnic people like the Karen, the Shan, are fighting back. That's not a stalemate. But how are they fighting back? The defiance is there in people's lives day after day. You know, even when things seem still on the surface, there's always movement underneath. It's like a frozen lake, and beneath our lake, we are progressing bit by bit." Now, my next project on my syllabus is going to be a book of Tibetan folk tales, but we're not going to talk about the Dalai Lama. We're going to talk about monks who live in a place called Zanskar. It's in western Tibet, high up in the mountains, very, very poor, but it has 7 ancient monasteries. And the monks there have launched a program to educate the children, and again, the children must leave their home in order to be educated. So that's my next project. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's okay, I didn't need it. Thanks.
Good. Well, we've had some conversation and presentations about how peace has changed a profession, encouraging a profession to look differently at itself and its professional preparation of counselors, counselor educators, and also an opportunity to hear a presentation on how education is a tool of activism. And I think it's very difficult because to discuss peace in any concept or in any context, we have to recognize that peace is laden with values. And so how do we maintain our objectivity as educators or mental health professionals around such an issue that has so many values around it and has so much meaning to so many different types of people? And so now we're here, the final presentation of this afternoon, Developing Global Competence in Our Students, the Role of Academic Institutions. So Barb.
So hang in there, everybody. When Carol was talking earlier, not this morning, that's what my day's been like, about students who believe that there's always been war and that's the way it is and that's the way it will always be. There is someone who I love very much, my husband, who has given up on the world. His comments went to me as I was preparing for this presentation were, we hate them, they hate us. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it's going to be. There was war during my entire life. There was war before I was born. All your la-di-da is not going to make a difference in the world. And I said, well, besides depressing the heck out of me, I do believe that I'm a very practical person. And I believe that if we can get to the root of the problem, we can begin to prevent these kinds of things from going on. And that's my focus. My expertise is in information security, information technology, and the need is to prevent things from occurring. Because once they've occurred, you have the damage. Once war has begun, it's hard to stop it. Once hate has begun, it's hard to stop it. If we can get to the root of the problem, and my personal belief is that much of this hate, much of this war, much of this violence is based on simply a lack of understanding. The other culture, the other people, the other country are someone we don't know. They're not like us. So therefore, we can treat them as if they're non-humans. And so my approach being practical is we have students in our colleges for a minimum of 4 years if they're anything like my daughter. And during that time, we can help them become globally competent, understand what it means to interact equally with people of different cultures, different nationalities. Unfortunately, one of the hesitations on the part of universities to move forward with this idea of global competence is a lack of agreement on the definition. And I'm going to share with you a couple definitions, but the bottom line is none of that should stop us from moving forward because they're similar. Darla Deardoff, who was one of the first people in 2006 who did some formal studies as to what global competence means, really described it as an ability to communicate effectively and appropriately with people from different cultures. You have to be able to identify and understand cultural differences. People are not all like us. They're not like me. You have to understand it, and you have to be able to appreciate those differences and collaborate with other cultures. More recently, the Global Leadership Excellence Group have developed a global competence model. And this builds on Darla Deardoff's model because it starts with a self-awareness. It starts with you knowing exactly where you're coming from. What are your beliefs? What are your biases? What are your preconceptions? Where are you at? Because unless you really understand that, you're not going to be able to assess your reactions to other people in other cultures. So you have to, diversity is a subset of global competence, and I have to share with you, I'm from the Detroit area, worked at GM for 10 years before I joined academia. When we talk about diversity and global competency in the Detroit area, we're talking about nationalities, cultures, races, religions. When I came to Ferris, someone told me that diversity in Ferris is having students from the UP in your class. It's kind of funny, but it also means that we're dealing in some educational settings with folks who have been very isolated. And so to first have them examine what they believe and these misconceptions about the Holocaust, about all kinds of nationalities, there's just all kinds of them, is where you have to begin with that. You can then add to that facts, knowledge, experiences to allow the students to become globally aware. Talk about the difficult issues. Talk about the fact that some things seem as if you can't resolve them until you begin to examine and take each other's perspective. And I like the idea of forcing people to take a side in a debate that they don't believe in, because it becomes something important to them. And then when they flip sides to the other side, they begin to experience the fact that different peoples, based on their perceptions, their countries, their cultures, can have very different views. So in 2006, Darla Deardoff did an extensive study with academics and scholars to say, if we were to assess global competence in our students, what kinds of things would we look for? And so she came up with 22 characteristics, and we're just going to talk about a subset of them. One is to communicate effectively and appropriately in multicultural situations. And communicate effectively doesn't always mean talking. It means listening. And it means understanding nonverbal gestures. When a shake of a head no doesn't mean no. Or when my students from India, when they agree with me because they're showing respect for me and nod their head yes, but they really don't believe it. To understand the nonverbal as well as the verbal communications that different students have, and have students experience that with each other. The ability to shift your frame of reference to see things from another perspective. And this is not easy. You have to really dig in deep and understand and listen as to what it's like. The stories we have here of the sadness that so many countries and so many people in our country experience breaks my heart. But you have to be, from that comes some very different views of the world. And if you are communicating, if you're conducting business, if you're negotiating, you have to understand those different frames of reference. You have to understand the Japanese view that you don't single out one person and say, great job, because that makes them feel bad. They are a group culture. So you have to shift your frame of reference. You have to know behaviors, shaking of the head, nonverbal as well as verbal. You have to understand those and become aware of them. And you have to have good interpersonal skills. And once again, let me go back to listening. Listening is probably one of the best interpersonal skills you can have to develop an understanding of people and their viewpoints. And it's not just viewpoints. It's different people approach problem solving differently. Different cultures approach all kinds of things differently. And in my classes, if my students are looking into a certain problem related to business intelligence, data analytics, they're also responsible for researching how other countries and nationalities view and deal with this problem, because it's different. And that is, as I'll get to, one of my strong and underlying beliefs about developing global competence in students. It can't be a separate activity. You send everybody off to somewhere to research or read or go on the computer. You have to integrate these activities into your course. They have to be a part of it, and I'll talk about how some of that happens. Anyways, you can see that there are several different types of competencies that you can measure. And actually, there are assessments out there that you can measure. We have to, so why is global competence important? I don't think I have to say much more than what everybody else has said already. Global competence is our prevention. It's to stop things from continuing the way they have. It's to have people understand and truly accept and appreciate the differences in different cultures. It is our only tool to be able to stop what I call the madness. Irregardless of what my husband says, I think we can make some changes, although many people, young and old, have given up because they don't see. But war doesn't begin instantaneously. Disagreements, conflicts, different views, different cultures lead up to war, lead up to violence. You can't, I'm not so la-di-da, as my husband says, that I think we can stop all war, but I think we can prevent conflicts from escalating by developing global competence. And from a business viewpoint, businesses are looking for students who can understand how to work in the global environment. There is not a business out there, a successful business today, that isn't having international products, works. You have to understand the cultures. You have to understand how to do business, how to communicate. So from a very practical point of view, this is essential. So to achieve this goal, academic institutions have to accept responsibility. Whether or not we all agree on one definition of global competence, we have to accept that that is part of our job in preparing students to enter the world as responsible citizens. It has to be integrated with our course objectives, not separate from not a separate class. I mean, we have global awareness classes, we have cultural classes. The best way is to, in their course of study, in their area of interest, to see how global competence fits into your actual courses. Teachers have to be globally aware themselves, and that is an important challenge for us to become, as teachers, globally aware and constantly open to bringing in the rest of the world in our classroom. Unless we do that, then it's, as what everybody else has been talking about, we see this continued sadness and brutality in the world. So, one question that has had a lot of research back and forth is many universities believe that study abroad is the solution. You send students over for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Is it enough? It's not enough. It can help if it's a significant immersive experience, but oftentimes study abroad is a pretty isolated experience for a lot of the students. They may visit places, but they're not as immersed in the culture. Also, many students nowadays can't afford study abroad. And so we have to be able to develop global competence without depending on that, and we can't depend on that to necessarily bridge the gaps. My daughter spent weeks in Germany. Does she understand the German culture? Not really. I mean, it was you're once again in a pretty protective environment when you study abroad. So it's not that we should eliminate it, it's just that that shouldn't satisfy us as academic institutions. You have to integrate it into the classroom, so you have to become globally competent yourself. You have to have students understand their own cultural norms and expectations, because from there they can reach out. And you also have to allow them that experience. There are different experiences. I'm a technology advocate. I'm also a social media advocate, because the world is open globally when you use these different tools. But the UN has a technology-based study course where students from around the world discuss, debate, and try to resolve issues similar to what the UN faces. So you can have your students experience these kinds of situations, and I think technology has helped us a great deal. Even something as simple, I show YouTube videos in my classroom. Most people do because it wakes up the students for 10 minutes. But do you show videos of people from another country, another culture, talking about that topic of interest? Or do you choose the YouTube videos that you're most comfortable with? People like you. Very simple things can make a difference just by putting people from different cultures up there as experts. It can be a tremendous difference. Speakers don't have to be there in real life. Skype is a fantastic way to video conference with people around the world. I edited a book that had authors from 6 different countries. How did we communicate? Skype. So you can bring in people, other students. You can open the world up and still make it relevant to the material that you are teaching. It can't be pushed aside to the International Studies Department. You have to make it part of your course curriculum. And so there are 500,000 schools right now who are participating in that Model UN conference. So that's one kind of tool, and I've given some other sites and references. There are some handouts for you. But as they role play the difficult job of being a UN ambassador and trying to balance the interests of so many countries, it becomes a real challenge. Do I have 2 more minutes? In my business intelligence class, I give them a spreadsheet that details countries and a number of parameters about their countries. How much AIDS do they have? How many wars have gone on? And they pretend they have $50 million to divide up. And they analyze and look at all the different parameters and have to present why they decided to allocate the money to these different countries. So it forces them to think in other people's shoes. You should also, this is very old but still very relevant, discuss the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with your students. Open it up. See if people agree that there are universal rights that belong to all of us. It's a good, because not everyone will. I mean, you will meet students and people who have given up or who have grown up so closed in that they're afraid to let the rest of the world in. And I view that with sympathy rather than anger, really. So you can assess global competence through papers, through case studies, through presentations, through global competence assessments. There's a number of different ways, and that would be appropriate to your course. But of course you want to know, is it working? Are you opening up the minds of these students? And so you can do that in any number of ways. And you're not alone. There's a number of resources available to you to help you with course materials, sample curriculums, resources, other kinds of material to help you bring global competence into your classroom. How about that? Perfect timing. Michigan State, just a little upcoming conference. Michigan State on November 3rd is having a conference on promoting global learning in undergraduate education, and Darla Deerdoff is presenting there. So if this is an area of interest to you, there is another conference focusing on it. Thank you. I'll close this out.
Again, 3 wonderful talks. We have time for questions. We've had some good talks now about how a profession has been impacted, about how education can be used as a tool for activism, and the responsibility we have as educators to use that tool wisely, and also about the need to instill in our students competencies and abilities in global competence. So we have time for a few questions to our panelists.
I guess I'll kick off. I have one.
I
have a comment and then sort of a topic for discussion that I'd like to get your thoughts on. First off, in the last presentation there, I was very pleased to see that you did not use the term global citizen, but rather, which is, always been sort of a stupid term, right? That it was briefly popular in academia to talk about global citizenship, which is quite literally an oxymoron, right? There is no global nation state. And we move beyond that to, as you were discussing, right, global competence, which is a much more logical goal, right, to aspire to in our students. And I also, as someone who's dedicated part of his professional career to study abroad, I'm also, like you, aware of the limitations of it. And that's why I, always feel it's important to connect, the themes of a study abroad program to other activities on our campus. And I'm very curious to get more ideas about that. right? How do we, connect what would be possible through study abroad, but then broaden that out on a campus so as not to allow study abroad to become something that's only accessible to the elites, right? To create the study abroad student, the global citizen, as this new, in a Marxist sense, right? This elite, upper class of learner, right, in the world, but rather to extrapolate that experience, right, for a broad student population, right, from, different socioeconomic classes, right? For example, community college students. And how can we make that competency real? And I really appreciate the examples that you've given. And so it's a very exciting thing to hear global competency discussed and to talk about different methods that you've employed to do that.
I do want to say that there are organizations that can link your students to students in other countries. So even if you can't study abroad, you can still work. You can both discuss the same issues, work together on projects, and so you can still get some of that experience throughout a course.
Susan.
First, I want to applaud your efforts to bring this into the college community, because I do think it is one of the first steps towards finding a way of reconciliation throughout our global community. However, in many of our large cities, smaller cities in America, we have children killing each other in our junior and senior high schools. Don't you think that this has to be incorporated in K-12?
Absolutely.
Because I think we're not too late, but we're too late for a lot of people to change that cultural mindset that has happened from the circumstances in which they grow up.
Absolutely. As early as you can start, the better. My focus was in the college environment, but absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to make a quick comment, kind of going off of what you just said, especially starting in the K-12. I speak Spanish. I've taught Spanish at the college level, and I've often thought that language and learning another language is really important in what you're talking about, and an actual real bilingual education, not kind of the way we often do it in K-12, because it is possible, and I do think it is possible, and I think it's a matter of perspective and the language teacher's perspective, and because kids are very capable of learning another language, even at the middle school and high school levels, and I think that language is an important component of that, because you can't learn another language without having to understand something about their culture. Language and culture are so intertwined, and so.
Some researchers believe that that is a key part of global competence. The problem is that unless it's taught correctly, it can become this siloed activity. The idea of learning another language is also learning the elements of that culture. And so, yes, it's very powerful.
Other questions? Yes, Colonel.
Just a comment. I like your reference to the Model United Nations, because I had 3 boys that all did it in high school. And when I was in Kosovo, I had to open a Model UN session in a Serbian high school, but the program was run by an Albanian instructor, which I thought was kind of an interesting, they were doing some serious conflict resolution at rather junior level. So I thought and it was interesting because I could tell they were discussing the same problems and resolutions that my oldest son had to discuss in New York State that same year. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with discussing difficult things. I mean, that's what we have to learn how to do.
But yeah, and just the fact that all these children across, worldwide are all discussing the same set of problems too,
Powerful.
rather than
Yes.
concentrating a problem specific to, their corner of the world. I thought was interesting. And thank you. They're all good presentations.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Others have questions? I think one of the things that's most interesting for me from the panel this afternoon is just the realization that peace as a very complex concept and practice is a skill. It's not something that just emerges if you put a lot of resources in the right place at the right time. If you put all the right things in the right place at the right time, you don't necessarily know that people know what to do then or how to engage with one another. And my own discipline, health education as well as counselor education, we often talk about healthy relationships. And the ability to have a healthy relationship, to recognize the characteristics of a healthy relationship are as important as the ability to recognize the characteristics of unhealthy relationships and know what to do to not become entangled in them. But we often underestimate the difficulty of really being able to engage in positive relationships, to be able to engage in civil behavior, to be able to engage in all of the very complex decisions that we make that result in a kinder culture or a more thoughtful culture, a more reflective culture. And so I think that starting in K through 12 and prolonging that into institutions of higher education so that programs are not isolated, they're not standalone programs, but they're woven throughout the general education curriculum as well as just the K through 12 curriculum. We really have the opportunity to promote citizenry and civility and things that can result in conflict mediation, that when we encounter conflict, we know how to respectfully go about that conflict. And we know how to have anger as well, that we don't mark out or mark off or make our affective lives exclusive to negative, what are considered negative affect, but that we can be fully who we are and be respectful at the same time. So I hope you all have enjoyed the conference as much as I have. We have a brief break now, and then there's a dinner, and then we hope to see many of you tomorrow. We'll continue on, and we will end tomorrow with the first diversity lecture series. Avram Berg will be speaking, and so we look forward to seeing you all there. So, Bob, you have final words?
Just that I've been informed that the doors will open for dinner in just under half an hour at 5:45. Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you.